Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm here to do what I feel like is a really on-brand recommendation video, and that is recommending and discussing some of my favorite messed up books. These are some of the most messed up books I've ever read. Basically, they are disturbing, they are uncomfortable, they have tons of content and trigger warnings, so watch out for that if that's something that you try to avoid. But I'm going to be talking about books that made me very uncomfortable in the past, and because of that, I tend to just enjoy books that make me feel a way because I can be a really insensitive or disconnected reader. So I love books that make me just feel uneasy as I'm reading them. Some of these books are books that would cross over in previous videos I've done about some of the scariest or most disturbing books I've read, but for one reason or another, I consider them to be really effed up. And I am going to be talking about these books in vague terms, so if you follow my channel, you know that I am really careful about spoilers, but I'm going to make some vague references to certain content warnings, just because otherwise I can't really discuss why these books are messed up. But trust me, I'm going to keep the spoilers to a minimum and really just discuss the themes and ideas and kind of general content that you're going to find within these books. But you can definitely still watch this video even if you haven't read any of the titles. All that being said, let's get started. So let's start out for the classic, and I want to talk about American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis. And this is of course a very iconic book, made perhaps more popular by the famous film, and I really enjoyed this one. We follow this upscale businessman who of course has these psychopathic urges and potentially starts to act upon them. And this is a book that I wasn't originally sure I was going to like when I got into it, because the main character is very unlikable, and that's on purpose. And I just really enjoyed this one because it really pushed the limits. This one, just like the movie, is ultra violent. It has some incredibly uncomfortable scenes involving sex workers and of course the massacres that may or may not be happening. And it's just, yeah, super violent. I feel like the author does not hold back whatsoever, so tons of content warnings all throughout this book. But I really enjoyed it because I thought it was a great commentary on just kind of the lifestyle of Wall Street brokers and sort of that high-end sort of particular class, New York City, and kind of capturing a certain kind of point in time in history and all of that. And so I think this book is just really iconic and really smart in terms of a commentary, but also, like I said, really messed up. Not for everyone, but like I said, I enjoy books that make me think, oh my gosh, what am I reading? And I definitely had those moments in this book here. Next, let's talk about Dark Places by Gillian Flynn, which is a very popular thriller, but if you don't know, it's told over multiple points of view. We follow a young woman who, as a child, she sent her brother to jail for the murder and massacre of her family, and then we also get some other timelines and perspectives, so we get to follow the brother in the time leading up to the massacre, and then also the mother's perspective, and you see how everything weaves together. The daughter, now as an adult, is contacted by a group that wants to revisit the case, and well, possibly it's more complicated than she thought it was. So that's the basic setup, and this is a book that I picked up years ago when I was first getting into thrillers, and I was very new to adult fiction, and I remember reading a few scenes within this book, and there was one scene particularly where I got so uncomfortable that I put the book down on my nightstand. I don't think I've touched the book for days, and I just thought I felt very bad for enjoying this book, and I felt very guilty for liking it. And I just wasn't sure if I could continue. Now, thankfully, Gillian Flynn, of course, is such a good writer that she did tempt me, and I did go back and finish the book, which definitely helped to round out my perspective. Once you get to see the conclusion of the book, you know the reason that she put all of those uncomfortable moments in there, because it does fit within the narrative. It does feel very purposeful. But there are two scenes I'm going to keep really vague, but one of those scenes involves a kiss, which probably, if you haven't read the book, makes me sound like a big prude, but trust me, it's a very uncomfortable kiss. And then there's also another scene, which is the one that actually made me put down the book for a while, where the one character finds some items of clothing. And because I did not understand why that clothing was there, I got super uncomfortable and thought, I should not be reading this book. This is disgusting, and almost DNF'd the book. But thankfully I did continue on. It's one of my all-time favorite books, and like I said, a big reason I love it so much is that it's a book that really left a big impression on me, and is one that I'm still thinking about today, and I love it even more every time I reread it. Then we have a horror book called String Follow by Simon Jacob, and this book follows a group of young people that are all living in this town that seems to be controlled by some kind of entity or presence that is causing the teenagers to act in a certain way. Everyone seems to be targeted targeting towards one girl, and there is some kind of purpose or goal behind all of their actions. It's a book that is very slow and meandering, and you just kind of watch the pieces fall into place. And it's a book that is very uncomfortable because it basically hits on so many content warnings. So in terms of suicide, mass gun shootings, we have cutting and attempted rape and so many other things that I'm probably forgetting that are in this book. But I remember reading this and being like, wow, this author is really pushing the envelope. They're really trying to make me uncomfortable, and well, it's working. Now this book is just, I feel like, very unique. It's quite different than a lot of the standard horror books that I read, and I like the fact that, like I said, it almost has a meandering feel to it in the way that you don't entirely know where the book is going, and it definitely takes its time to get there. But I thought that the characters, who again are very difficult to read about because they're very unlikable, they're doing very despicable things to each other. Think about the worst things that teenagers can do to themselves and to each other, and all of that is within this book. And so it's kind of a book where you're like, where is this going, and is the payoff going to be worthwhile? I don't think it's a perfect book, but at the same time, I do love so much about it. And again, if you're going to talk a messed up book with lots of content warnings, this is definitely one of those that I do want to recommend for those of you looking to push the envelope. Next up, let's talk Complicity by Ian Banks, and this is a story that is told through primarily the perspective of a journalist who's investigating these vigilante attacks that are happening. So basically, some sort of vigilante person or group is seeking out justice on those that have been harmed. So for instance, there's a judge that lets a rapist go free, and because of that, this vigilante comes in and tries to seek justice by taking vengeance on them. So there are some really nasty, despicable scenes within this book, very uncomfortable. Particularly the rape scene very early on within the book was very difficult to read. So if you have any concerns, if you have any triggers or personal content warnings that you try to avoid, definitely steer clear of this one. I will say that I did not entirely love this book, but it certainly was messed up, so I wanted to talk about it in this video. The reason I didn't love it though was actually more to do with the prose and the writing style, which I found to be very weak. It is a very offensive book, but I was less so offended by the book and more so regretting that I didn't feel like the prose really held up and made the story as strong as it could have been. So not a personal favorite of mine, but is it messed up? Absolutely. Next, if we're going to talk messed up books, let's discuss Lolita, which is the iconic classic following a man who takes responsibility for this young woman that he is just enamored with, and in doing so he takes her on this road trip and preys upon her. And I went into this book thinking that it couldn't be that bad because it's a classic, because it's old, so I thought it was going to be pretty tame. I thought it was a book about a man with an obsession with a young girl, which is obviously the beginning of the book, but it definitely goes there. There is pedophilia and all of the harm to children that you would expect or worry might be in this book. It is there. It is beautifully written, which I think kind of masks the despicableness of this book and makes it very uncomfortable to admit how much a lot of us readers really do enjoy it in terms of a novel with some beautiful prose. But the story underneath, when you actually pay attention to what is happening to Lolita, and of course we get the whole story told from this man's perspective, so we get to see everything through his skewed, messed up mind, it makes the story so much worse. So I remember just being enamored by the story, finding the prose beautiful, and yet thinking, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm reading this. I can't believe this is a classic that people read in school and study in university and is like praised and put on this pedestal. Because don't get me wrong, I think it's an important book, but is it messed up? Is it disturbing? Is it one of the craziest classics that I have ever read? Absolutely. And I really think that if you haven't read it, if you can stomach it, it is definitely a book that is worth checking out. I think it's very profound, but very, very messed up. And if we're going to talk about Lolita, then we should also talk about My Dark Vanessa, which is a dark contemporary story that was very much inspired by the author trying to process their feelings towards Lolita. So I actually read this book first, and it was the reason that I went back and read the classic afterwards. But in the story, we follow a woman who is reflecting back on her years in school, where she became involved with a man that was teaching at the boarding school she went to. And she does not see herself as a victim, but we as a reader, of course, see it in a different light. And well, I gotta say, unsurprisingly, because it's in this video, this book was really difficult to read. There was a particular scene involving her with this man, and the book really doesn't hide things from the reader. It's a very uncomfortable scene involving pajamas and all of that, and I was like, oh my gosh, this book is going there. I thought it was going to be all kind of, hidden from the reader and kind of talked about behind curtains, but the author really again pushed the envelope and just made me very uncomfortable. But that being said, it was a very thought-provoking book. I think it had some really good conversations around pedophilia and just the consent and importance of protecting child victims, and just that they're not potentially at a point where they can really make that consent for themselves regardless of what they feel they might be able to do. Just really deep conversations about really important topics. And it made for a very uncomfortable reading experience, but I definitely understood the hype. So many people love this book, and I was a little bit hesitant. I didn't read it when it first came out, but when I finally did pick it up, wow, was it a memorable read. I could not put it down. And yeah, it definitely is a book that stuck with me over the years, and definitely one I want to return back to and kind of revisit again and again, because again, I think it's a really smart book that has some really good conversations that need to be had within society, and it just brings up some really good points about a subject that other people just don't want to talk about, but it's happening, so it needs to be addressed. And along a similar line, I also want to recommend a thriller called Tampa, and this is another story that takes a look at pedophilia. This one is a bit of a gender bender because it has a female teacher preying on a male student. So normally you see it twisted the other way. But this one is a very interesting read because it is told in almost a satirical manner, or just in a unique perspective that we're reading the whole book through the perspective of the teacher. And so she, of course, has no remorse for her actions and is simply just fulfilling this craving, and it just makes the book so much more uncomfortable compared to some of the other books I'm talking about. This one is a little bit more light in tone, so I don't feel like it takes the subject matter quite as seriously as perhaps it should. But if you're looking again for a really messed up book that takes a topic that other writers just will not touch because it is so despicable, and takes it on and tries to turn it into this like crazy thrill ride with twists and turns and all of that, I think it's very ballsy of the author to have written this book, and it definitely has a lot of mixed reviews because a lot of people fairly or unfairly think that this book is just disgusting. But if you're interested in a book that is definitely going to push the envelope, make you uncomfortable, again, this is definitely one that I had to put on this list. And finally, I want to talk about 3 Nights in the Pink Tower by Evie Knight, which is a horror novella that is inspired by real events, which is probably the biggest reason that this book is very uncomfortable and very messed up, because the author basically looks back on an event that happened to them when they were younger and then wrote it into a fictional story. But because it's based off real events, it makes the read so much more sobering. Essentially, this young woman had strangers appear at her door and they kidnapped her away at gunpoint, spent these 3 days in this other place, and she was of course raped and attacked and all of the terrible violence you would expect to happen. And that is written into the story. It is done in a way that I think is tasteful for the reader. Like, it's not meant to excite the reader in any way, but it is very hard to look away in those scenes and very hard to read. And especially knowing again that while it's technically fiction, it's based off fact, which makes it just really, really troubling. So I have to be cautious when I recommend a book like this. Unlike some of the other books on this list, I don't want to call this book fun, but rather I think it's very important, and it takes a look at some very messed up things that happen to real people, and I think that it's a very sobering read. But was it incredibly uncomfortable to read? Was it disturbing? And it's just messed up in a more serious way than some of these other books I'm talking about, because again, the fact that this is all based off something that happened. So anyway, not to end on a bummer note, but that is one more book I wanted to add to my list of messed up books that made me very uncomfortable, because that was a really difficult read. All right, we've made it to the end of the video here. I'd love to hear first of the books I talked about. Are there any that are tempting you to check out for yourself? And of course, I would love to hear your recommendations for what is the most messed up book that you have ever read. What is the book that made you feel so uncomfortable that you wanted to put it down? I, for whatever reason, am just drawn to these type of books, and so I do continually read them on my channel. So if you're new here, please consider subscribing if you do want to hear more about horror thrillers and true crimes that are very uncomfortable. I also do read adult science fiction and fantasy. If you want to help me out with this video, you can give it a thumbs up. You can share it around online on like Reddit and Twitter and all of that. And you can also give this video a little comment, even if it's just an emoji. Like, I guess find me an emoji of something very uncomfortable. I don't even want to know, but get creative in the comments down below. And if you want to help me out more, you can hit that little notification bell. That way you never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.